Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's lecture, we're going to discuss M.K. Gandhi's work Hindi Swaraj. Now, before we start discussing the book or the text, we need to understand two things. One, while understanding sociology of India or society in India, why do we need to read a book like Hindi Swaraj? And number two is that how do we read a text? What is the relevance of the text? So first trying to answer why in understanding sociology of India or the society in India, we need to understand or read different perspective. In earlier lectures in the series Sociology of India, I have discussed about the colonial discourse. The colonial discourse was Orientalist effort to understand India as an object of study. We would study society in terms of village, caste, family, and the Orientalists, they evolved a kind of an understanding of social transformation whereby caste was changed to class, villages into urban areas, and so on and so forth. The second perspective to understand society in India is a nationalist discourse, the way in which the nation, that is India, was imagined in the minds of great scholars and important dignitaries and leaders, nationalist leaders. And that is how some of our great minds like Gandhi, Ambedkar, Nehru visualized India as a nation. And the third perspective to understand society in India, which comes in much later, is the subaltern perspective, which tries to understand the marginalized, those from the below. So in today's lecture, when we pick up a text called Hindi Swaraj, the focus is to understand India as a nation in political imagination. So we are using a text to understand India's society as it was visualized or imagined by great person like Gandhi. And the second question, that is when we read a text, specifically when we read a text which was written so many decades back, how do we go about it? We need to keep in mind three important things while reading any book. One is the context in which the particular book was written, implying the political socio-economic conditions which were prevalent when the author or scholar was writing the book. Two, what was the content and how relevant was the content in terms of not only giving us a imagination of India at that particular point of time, but is that text still relevant to understand society? And number three is to understand how that book was received or the reception, and that is what were the critique or criticism or how was it was accepted by the larger mass or critical analyst. So we will keep in mind these ideas of reading a text and refer to this work Hindi Swaraj to understand the imagination, the political imagination of India as a nation. So let us begin. And we know Hindi Swaraj as a term means home rule, and this was specifically Indian home rule, a text written by Mohanchand Karamchand Gandhi in 1909. It was published in 1909, and it was a kind of a self-acclaimed work which was kind to make sense of the society in India at a time when India was not only under the foreign British colonial rule, but it was also making step ahead towards of visualizing a nation which would be independent of foreign power. And therefore, in 1921, Gandhi, while describing this work, Hindi Swaraj, mentions that the whole theory of life, it's kind of a clear-cut depiction of individual living this life in India. And by 1938, he stated that I have seen nothing to make me alter the views expressed in it. So something that he writes in 1909, even after 2-3 decades, he doesn't want to bring about any change, but that in terms kind of suggests that this book was reflecting the experience of the individuals and the way the India would be visualized by the larger society. The Hindi Swaraj is regarded as a personal manifesto. It is not just any kind of a book or a manuscript. It is kind of a challenge of civilization. It is one of the classical text or classical philosophy of civilization. And basically, through this work, Gandhi was criticizing the Western civilization. So when India as a nation was emerging, the idea was not only to kind of do away with the foreign rule, but also in terms of to do away with the cultural influence of the Western society on the way in which civilization was understood, the way in which Indian civilization, the meaning it had for the people. And therefore, in his work, Gandhi challenged British claims to a superior civilization and the rationale of the Pax Britannica. He was kind of making the Indians realize that it is kind of not correct always to consider the Western civilization as superior to the Indian civilization. And through the book, he says that what is a true civilization would be found in this India itself. So in his title, you have this, it's a kind of a very small booklet form, but it kind of gives us ideas about the cultural, the political, the economic notion of India as a nation. So when we go about the book, we see we need to look into the time when it was written, it was published. That will help us to make sense of understanding the content of the book. So in November 1909, during Gandhi's return trip from England to South Africa, after an abortive mission, this small book of about 30,000 words was written. So it was first written in Gujarati, which was kind of the language that Gandhi was familiar. And he was writing this book while he was returning from England to South Africa. And this, while he was using his right hand and it got tired, he shifted to left hand. So it was a continuous, meticulous effort in time at making a sense of what was happening around him. So it was almost 10 days or 40 of the 275 pages being written with the left hand. It was published with nettle in the Indian Opinion and was soon banned by the British government. It was kind of considered as a seditious text. Now, why did the British government ban the book? The reason is that it was kind of reflecting the personal opinion of Gandhi, and much of the text was a critique of Western civilization, and therefore it was banned. In order to demonstrate the harmlessness and the inner essence of the book, Gandhi published an English translation, and on 21st December 1938, the ban was officially lifted. It is a very important text that we should all be familiar with it, but it has not attained the kind of recognition that it should. So when we go back, what was the context in which it was written? Now, one of the context in which it was written was also to make sense of the different perspective or conflicting perspective regarding independence, the nationalist struggle. So in history, we are familiar that they kind of a two kind of thought or perspective. One was the extremist perspective that wanted to take recourse to rebellion, to violence, to war and get independence. The other were the moderate who were kind of wanted to sustain in a long struggle of non-violence or ahimsa and kind of force Britishers to move out of India. Now, Gandhi, while in London, met one of the extremists, that is G.D. Savarkar, and he was kind of of opinion, or he was convinced that if India had to get independence, if India had to win independence from the foreign rule, it was only through armed insurrection. So Gandhi and Savarkar had a long detailed discussion over the means and ends of the struggle for India's freedom, but they could not come to an agreement. It kind of was opposed to each other. Gandhi, unlike Savarkar, was convinced that India would win its freedom through moral and spiritual force, which was superior to material forces or the force of arms. So he was against brutal force. He was against the use of war or rebellion. And when we go into the content of the book, we'll see why he was against the armed rebellion or brutal force. So, and we are all familiar with the Gandhian thought of ahimsa and non-violence. So Gandhi wrote Hind Swaraj. The basic idea behind writing was to kind of explain the idea that India could get freedom by adopting the non-violence path. Now, the most important thing, and when we pick up a text like Hind Swaraj, is to see the format in which the book is written. And it's very interesting to note that Hind Swaraj is written as a dialogue. It's written as a dialogue between the editor and the reader. The editor is no one but Gandhi himself. So the reader raises a number of questions or certain kind of critical assessment of independence and the political economic condition, and Gandhi as an editor gives an answer to the question. And here in this text, he is represented as kind of a non-angry, patient and person giving answer to the reader who at this particular point of time, when there was so much of agitation and there was so much of anxiety over independence, the reader is actually annoyed, angry, and therefore he kind of have lot of questions that would focus on achieving independence through the militant way. But Gandhi, in his answer, in his kind of response to the reader, is able to convince that that Swaraj or independence, home rule, could be achieved by not necessarily going on to the path of war, but realizing the importance of your own culture, your civilization, understanding the religion, education, the way of modes of functioning of government, and that would lead to social transformation. So the book, when we see, is a dialogue. Gandhi adopts the dialogical mode. Why does he adopt a dialogical mode? In terms of discussion between the reader and the editor, the reason why he takes on to this kind of a format is that he wanted to write a book which could put into the hands of a child. It had to be so simple. It had to be kind of not some necessarily full of jargon or full of academic theories, but very simple text which any child could read and make sense of his society. The simplicity of the study is not only kind of talking about the simplicity of the text, but it is also reflecting Gandhi's style, not just in his writing, but in all that he did. When we read his book, The Experiment with Truth, we realize the simplicity with which he lived his life. So the advantage of the dialogue between the reader and the editor is that it gives you an opportunity to enter into a discussion, into a discourse, and kind of look into the various dimensions through which a particular issue can be understood. So Hind Swaraj is not a narrative text. It's not kind of any textbook that is to be referred, but it's a critical dialogue. It's a critique of the Western civilization, and it is addressing to the problems of the nation. It is addressing to the problems that the country was facing at that particular point of time, and it is also futuristic. Gandhi was kind of a visionary. He wanted to kind of create an order that India would, social order that would be more egalitarian, and it could be more in terms of aligned with the principle of democracy. So unlike a documentary conception of a text, it is an imaginative reconstruction. It's a reconstruction of the lived experience of the people, problems that people were facing at that particular point of time, and also imagining what the people would face 30 years or 40 years down. And we'll see that some of the questions of civilization, some of the questions of society that Gandhi raised in his work are still problematic, and we have been able to get a question to these answer to this question. So the reader asks the editor what he thinks about the Indian Home Rule. This is how the text begins. The editor replies that this question involves all three of this goal as a newspaper editor. And the focus is also on a very strong, very articulative role of the media in terms of spreading the ideas of democracy, of equality, and of independence. So he highlights that the goal of the newspaper editor is to express, change, and critique popular sentiment, not just to reproduce what is around there, but have a critical dialogue, have a critical assessment of the political economic conditions. Gandhi explains that Indian National Congress formed out of a desire for home rule. If we go into the history, we can try to figure out how the idea of a home rule came in from the moderates' desire to kind of go into the independence through the path of non-violence. But the reader points out that the group of London activists who call themselves the Young India Party view the Congress as a puppet for the Britishers. It begins with this dialogue between what was the objective of the formation of the Indian National Congress, how it was misrepresented among the people, and how there was a difference of opinion between the extremist and the moderate. The editor replies that the Congress founder, both Indian and English, dedicated their lives to the cause of home rule. But the reader angrily replies that this is irrelevant, especially the part about Englishmen. The editor focuses on uniting the dissenting sides by helping the reader see the moderate important contribution to the struggle for independence. Gandhi wanted his readers to see that the independence movement is an inclusive movement fighting to create an equally inclusive India. So when we kind of have a very critical assessment of the nationalist struggle, we realize that it was a time when India was not only kind of fighting against the foreign rule or the British rule. At the same time, it was a huge challenge to create a nation which would be more egalitarian, to create a nation that would be inclusive, because India was already kind of a nation which was stratified on the accounts of caste, creed, gender, and then you had this idea of what would happen when India achieves independence. Would it become a slave of its own people? So this text gives us a path towards an egalitarian, inclusive India. Now, what was Gandhi's intention? Why did he want to write a text like Hindi Swaraj? And we try to see that his was trying to address a mixed audience. The extremists, the moderates, he was talking to the Indians as well as to the Britishers, and the audience was kind of more complex in terms of not only an intellectual text that could be understood by the intelligentsia, but a text that could make sense to the mass. So his intention was to make things as simple so that common man could make kind of have a good idea of what would it mean of India as a nation post-independent period. The foremost reason for writing the text was his inner illumination and the consequent urge to communicate. In his foreword, he writes that there was a sense of urgency. I have written because I could not restrain myself. This is the line taken up from the Hindi Swaraj in his foreword. The second reason to write the text was that he wanted to clarify the meaning of Swaraj. Now, everybody was informed Hindi Swaraj is my birthright, and everybody wanted Swaraj. But did people know the actual meaning of it? And Gandhi's intention was to ensure that they kind of have a clear theoretical understanding, conceptual understanding of Hindi Swaraj. If we look into the objectives of the text, The book outlines Gandhi's critiques of Britain domination of India. Now, this domination was not only a political domination, it was also a cultural domination where Western civilization was presented as superior compared to Indian civilization, and the urge was to move towards Western society. So, Westernization as a social transformation was taking place. A lot of transformation in customs, laws, and traditions was happening. Gandhi encouraged Indians to reject armed conflict and adopt a policy of passive resistance. Hind Swaraj mainly discusses two main issues. One is a critique of modern civilization, and number two, the nature and structure of India, especially Indian Swaraj, and the means and methods to achieve it. So you find all these themes running in the text: nationalism, civilization, Swaraj, Satyagraha, passive resistance into his book. And when we look into the content, it has kind of 20 chapters which will talk about various dimensions of what is Swaraj, to what is true civilization, what is passive resistance, why we should kind of say no to brutal force, what was the conditions, a comparative understanding of the Western civilization and the Indian civilization. So, when we look into what we learn from Hind Swaraj, he says himself in the text that Hind Swaraj teaches the gospel of love in place of that of hate. It replaces violence with self-sacrifice. It pits souls force against brutal force. And he's telling us about modernity. He's kind of critiquing modernity, which is based on greed, lust for power, dominance, inequality, and all of this are outcome of modernity. And the larger outcome or negative consequences is that it has dehumanized us. So he identified India as a spiritual and religious civilization whose culture was superior to the modern Western civilization, and therefore it could become a text which is even relevant today. It is kind of something which we see that so much of consumerism, so much of disparity, so much of income gap, ecological imbalances leading to climate change and other socio-economic problems have aroused because Indians did not pay attention to the problems that were raised so decades and decades ago. It is important to read a text like Hind Swaraj and understand how there was a critical analysis of modernity, civilization, technology and science, and at the same time appreciate and kind of feel content with your own civilization, with your own culture that it is there. So if we look into the reception of the text, there are two ways. One is to take it as a blueprint, as a project, and that was a kind of a very successful project. But when we look into it in terms of the failure of other ideologies, dominant ideologies as Marxism and liberalism, there's a strong tendency to kind of look into Gandhian ideology as providing a new paradigm for alternative civilization framework. So this is the way we kind of make sense of an important text like Hind Swaraj that creates a political imagination of India as a nation. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.